What's the difference between the cakewalk of the 90s and 2012 in the literary business?
What's the difference between what it was like? I started in, signed my first deal in '95 into an industry where they were prepared to take a fairly long view. In other words, they gave me a decent advance and a 2-book deal, but I know that in their minds they were thinking ahead 5 or 6 years. It was going to be 5 or 6 years probably until I was halfway profitable, and then it might be another 5 years before I was a major seller, supposing I ever would be. And so it was an industry that was prepared to develop you for a decade. And that's what they did for me. I was at one publisher for 6 books, and they worked year on year, and then I switched to another publisher, and they ramped up the effort and worked year on year on year. And for all that people say, oh yeah, Lee Child, big seller, I wasn't a big seller, not until about, it was probably book 10 that was really a major, major bestseller. And I had remembered my agent at the very beginning saying in this business, it takes 10 years to be an overnight success. And it really was for me, literally 10 years. And what I'm saying is that now, the chances of a publisher actually committing even mentally to a 10-year plan is 0. You've got to get very lucky very quickly.
Do you start out by plotting your book to the nth degree, or do you start writing and see where it takes you?
I start writing and see where it takes me. I never plot anything, and right now I'm writing book 17, and I'm at about 82,000 words at the moment, and I still have no clue what is happening, or why, or where, or who did what. It just is a question of see what happens. Now, you ask that question to 10 writers, you're going to get 12 different answers, because some people do plot extensively. Jeffrey Deaver, for instance, I know he does a 200 or 300 page outline that he then expands into a book, although it not expands very much. He basically doubles it from 200 or 300 to 500 page book. And I couldn't do that. I could not possibly do that, because to me the fun is finding out what happens. I'm asking myself that same question that I recommend you ask the readers. Okay, I've got a thing, something's happening. What is it? What's going on here? I want to know what the answer to that question is. And if I were to plan it out beforehand in a synopsis, then I would know the answer. And I'd be ready to move on to the next thing. I would be very bored with that story. And the idea of sitting down and then turning that story into a complete novel, I would find dull, boring, because there's no tension in it. I know where it's going. And I think that boredom would show through in the writing, frankly, and it would make it a bad book. So for me, it's a question of, I have no clue. And it's a tough way to write, because every single minute is a fight. It's a decision, what happens now? A lot of the time I just wing it, say, yeah, let this happen. No, she's not dead, really. Whatever, just see what happens. And, but there is a sort of subconscious logic working, I think, which is why I said at the beginning, it's about your personality colliding with the body of work that you've consumed. I think, in a sense, our storytelling or story listening DNA is mapped out by what we've consumed. And so I'm subconsciously, I think, following general tropes that have been around for a long time. But I really can't tell. But it's all made up as I go along. And I find it hilarious, frankly, when somebody says, oh, I knew who it was on page 50. And I'm like, well, I didn't.
To that end, do you always find a way to make it go, or do sometimes you have to go, or say, you know what, this didn't work, I'm going back 3 or 4 chapters and have to go another direction?
I would rather slit my wrists than waste 3 or 4 chapters. But I think that I have I've developed a very keen dead-end detector, and I can pretty much tell within 4 or 5 words, I think, is this heading down a dead end? Does this look gloomy down here, or is there a light at the end of that tunnel? So I must say, this morning I cut out, even though, because I never rewrite either, I just get to the end and that's it. But what I do is every morning I will look at what I did yesterday. And so it's a question of combing through it day by day, 2 steps forward, 1 step back sort of thing. So this morning I looked at what I did yesterday and there were 14 words. There was a description where I was trying to picture this woman on one of those walkways with very low set lights so that she was vivid from the sort of knee down and kind of vague from the knee up because of the way the place was lit. And I just hadn't really captured it very well, so I just deleted it this morning. 14 words, and I wanted to die. I mean, is that inefficient or what? I need to get to the end of this book. It's about adding words, not taking them away.
I thought you were writing in September.
Why do I write in September?
No, I thought you said you started in September.
I started in September, yeah, but it's been a bit a year and I'm way behind.
Oh, okay, you're working on that.
Yeah, I'm still. Yeah.
One more question, then you won't buy books.
Are there things about Jack Reacher's background that you're still discovering yourself? And I was surprised I'm disappointed when you say he doesn't exist. I have a son who travels without a toothbrush. And I said, even Jack Reacher at least has a toothbrush.
I mean, that's a great, it's shading towards the MFA style question. There are other things about Jack Reacher that I haven't discovered yet. I mean, who's doing the typing here, you know? There's nothing about him except what I put down. So what you're really saying is, have I exhausted my imagination for any other trivia that I can put in about him in the next book? And no, I think there will always be something to do. I mean, in this book, for instance, I reveal that he can wink, but only with his left eye. And I explain the reason behind that, which is entirely autobiographical. I can wink with my left eye, but I can't wink with my right eye. We'll take a couple more. We haven't done our hour yet. These people are paid, you know, so we'll do a couple more questions until 8. This lady.
I found myself wondering, I can't really formulate the question, but when you're writing the book, you're both writer and reader. So you're fulfilling both of those.
That's a great point, yeah. The writer is also the reader, and in the first instance. And that is a great point. And that kind of goes to my point, are you happy with the book? Are you, as a reader, happy with the book you have just written, or that you are writing? So you're both writer and reader. And I suggest reader in a literal sense. Read it to yourself, read it out loud, which kind of harks back to my earlier point about oral storytelling. I think we were captivated way back in history by people with mellifluous rhythmic voices who could make it flow and suggest pace and rhythm and even accent, you know, just by the way they read. And I think the written line absolutely has to be like that. And I think that it is possible but difficult to tell just by looking at it. I think it's much easier to tell by reading it out. And I do that all the time. I read it out loud, which, you know, is another thing about the bizarreness of writers. You're sitting there making stuff up and talking to yourself. But you do it, generally speaking, alone in a room, so you're not offending anybody. That guy there.
Can you tell us why you decided to write under a pen name, and why you chose that particular name, and whether you have actually switched your name officially to that?
I've switched my name semi-officially. I have, you know, bank accounts and credit cards and identities. Well, actually, in several different names. But we didn't go into that too much. But like I said, I was always in showbiz. My first paid job, I was 17 years old. I worked for a very seedy agency that booked strippers, and ever since then, I've never had a job that didn't involve some kind of audience issue and you know, showbiz type issue. And I've worked under many, many different names, because in television, generally speaking, you're contracted to one producer. And so if you want to do if you get an offer somewhere else, or if there's a project you want to do, you've got to do it under a pseudonym, because you're not really allowed to be doing it at all. And typically, if you finish one project and you're starting another one, you might change your name. I changed mine originally because my first union job was as a stage manager in the theatre, and in Britain the stage managers are a member of Actors Equity, that union, and there's a rule in Actors Equity that if your name is similar, the same as or similar to an existing performer, you can't use it. And my real name was similar to, in fact identical to, a fairly famous British character actor. So I couldn't have used my own name even if I'd wanted to at that point. So I just got into the habit of having different names for different jobs. And this particular one, Lee Child, I wanted to have a name that was, had three desirable things. Number one, it was easy to hear and easy to say. And it should be a noun that was, a name that was also a noun, because that's even more memorable, especially Child, which for most people has a warm type of association, you know, not rather than snake or something like that. And the third rule is that it had to start with the letter C, because you know, it's patently obvious that in Western languages we browse from left to right, and we get fatigued very quickly in a browsing situation, and so early in the alphabet is a huge advantage. And in fact, when I started figuring this out, which was 1994, in the previous decade, 63% of New York Times bestsellers had been written by authors beginning with the letter C. So, you know, it was clearly an influential factor. Yeah.
Do you research locations?
I do research locations, but not specifically for the book. You know, I'm not the sort of guy who says, okay, writing a book, it's going to take place in, you know, Mississippi, therefore I'll go to Mississippi for 2 months with a notebook and a camera. What will have happened is I'll have already been to Mississippi for some unconnected reason, or on tour or something like that. I'll have hung out, driven around, seen this or that, and then maybe years later, I'm writing a book, I need a particular sort of feel for that book, and I think, oh, you know what, Mississippi would do for that. And so I then rely on my memories of it, and I usually try and supplement that with maps or guidebooks or something like that. I think research at the time is, we haven't got enough time to do it properly on a book a year, and also it then comes out too fresh. You know, you want to discard most of the research and stick with only the interesting parts, and you need a little time to get that distinction. Okay, one last question. That chap.
What role do editors in editing play now versus maybe what they did when you started?
What role do editors play now as opposed to when I first started? Well, as you can imagine, you know, very much diminished, frankly, because you know, literally for me, the first book was a major edit. Not so much for content necessarily, but certainly for length. I mean, I'd written that first book was very, very long, because I had this theory that we should account for every minute. You know, it should be an honest account, because it was written in the first person. It should not seem manipulative. In other words, the hero should not be seen to be omitting stuff that would be significant later. In order to produce confidence in the reader, I thought every step of the way should be accounted for. And so it came out very long, about 50% longer than it ended up. And so it was really an issue of that philosophical debate, you know, was it okay to cut it and make it slightly more deceptive, given that it was in first person? So yeah, there was a lot of editing for the first one, the second one less so, and so on and so forth, and now really none at all, other than, you know, the occasional suggestion for, you know, editors are people, believe it or not, and they have their own little predilections. My editor loves to, you can't just say a coat, it has to be blue coat or brown coat as well. It just needs that little bit of detail. So, and you know, it's a learning process. They know what I'm capable of doing, I know what they're going to object to. I did, in the middle period for the middle books, I did have a thing going where if I wanted to, if I had something in there that I really wanted to preserve, that I knew would be controversial, I would put in something even worse with the deliberate intention of taking it out. So that I'd send them this thing with the bogus element in, and they say, oh my God, we can't have that. And I say, oh yeah, right, fine, so I'll take it out and leave what I wanted left.